Hello again. This is another chapter from my next book, The Way of the Psychopath. If anybody is especially fond of old people, I would suggest not listening to this, as it might be found offensive. As before, I must remind viewers that this is meant to be tongue-in-cheek and not a serious self-help book. This chapter is called What Shall We Do with the Old Folk? Having examined in Chapter 1 the blended family, we now turn to another modern family problem, one already touched upon in the introduction, a class of people for whom Western society maintains a sentimental and wholly insincere regard, coining a host of euphemisms rather than calling them by their true name. The Nazis were, as was so often the case, more honest about this than most, using the expression Nutzler's Esse, or useless eaters, for those who contributed nothing to society and whose only role was to consume valuable resources. Today, we refer instead to senior citizens, old folk, pensioners, third agers, seniors, or simply the elderly. Dramatic and continuing advances in medicine mean that old people now live longer than ever. Nobody is enthusiastic about this state of affairs, for although the length of their lives may be extended for decades, they still grow increasingly reliant upon their relatives as the years progress. In other words, it may well be possible to ensure that any number of 90 or even 100-year-olds are still with us, but they are rarely able to live without extensive assistance from either their families or professional healthcare workers. It is more common today than it once was to live to 90, but those who reach this age are no healthier or more self-sufficient than people of that age were a century or two ago. The unspoken truth is that it is very annoying to find yourself lumbered with one of these ageing dependents. Nobody, of course, other than psychopaths, ever admits that this is so. We may outwardly tolerate or even appear to cherish the elderly members of our family, but inside a quiet fury builds because we see no end to the burden which their continued lives impose upon us. Very often, those family members doing the shopping and housework for the 90-year-old are in their 50s, 60s or even 70s themselves. At an age where they might once have been able to take things a little more easily. The children have left home or gone to university, and yet they have now been replaced by other people who must be cared for and looked after. There is also the undeniable fact that many of us had when younger fractious and tense relationships with our parents. Of course, since growing up and moving away from them, we are able over the years to forget how much irritation they caused us in our youth. When we feel obliged to see a lot of them, though, for instance when they become old and helpless, we remember just why they got on our nerves so much when we were teenagers. Sometimes middle-aged people find themselves trapped in the same cycle of ill-feeling and anger with their parents as was the case when they were 15 or 16. This is, to say the least of it, seldom a pleasurable or relaxing experience. A perfect instance of this was seen during the coronavirus pandemic in the early part of 2020. Many old people showed a marked reluctance to follow government advice and stay in their homes for months on end. Their middle-aged offspring often became infuriated by this irresponsible behaviour, and arguments took place as children tried to ground parents in their 70s and 80s. It was remarked by some of these middle-aged children that the whole experience reminded them strongly of the way in which these same elderly parents had tried to restrict their own movements when they were teenagers. The old tensions and resentments emerged after 30 years in hibernation and reminded the families of their old feelings of irritation and annoyance as the different generations once more got on each other's nerves in no small measure. This is typical of the feelings aroused whenever families have to have regular dealings with their older members, which with increasing lifespans is now very common. For the psychopaths among us, the situation is fairly simple and straightforward. Like the rest of us, their elderly relatives are often an intolerable burden, but they are able to accept this disagreeable truth and even laugh at it. The knowledge does not become a guilty secret, a canker eating away at them. The old people are nonetheless irritating for this honesty, but at least the secret guilt is not generated, and the state of affairs faced squarely. Of course, if the psychopath, after weighing up the pros and cons, decides he really cannot endure spending time with his elderly mother, he is able simply to drop her like the proverbial hot potato, without feeling any pangs of conscience, an option unavailable to the more guilt-ridden and hypocritical among us. There is, of course, one great difference between the situation at which we looked in Chapter 1, that of being stuck with somebody else's children, and that at which we are now looking, which is to say feeling compelled to come into regular contact and even take care of an old person. It is this. In general, people like children. They enjoy watching them at play, hearing their voices and laughter, even seeing them walk down the street on the way to nursery or school. Children are agreeable to encounter. The same can hardly be said for old people. Watching them shuffle along the pavement is a profoundly depressing sight. Quite apart from the fact they are not nearly as aesthetically pleasing to look at as small children, they are a grim reminder of our own fate in all too few years. As they are now, so too will you be in a short while. That creaking old fossil picking his way painstakingly across the landscape is a premonition of what is in store for us all. Let us speak plainly, and before going any further, consider a statement which is unequivocally true, although by common consent seldom spoken aloud. Nobody likes old people. There's a hallowed and ancient convention that we must pretend to care about old folk because of their frailty, vulnerability, lovable natures or accumulated store of wisdom. The fact is that we all find them tremendously irritating. The reasons for our dislike of the old range from the relatively trivial to the extremely serious. The very presence of old people in our lives often annoys us, without their having done anything other than existing and being visible to us. They don't actually have to do anything to be a source of irritation. Take, for example, a common but fairly trifling objection to seeing old people in public. This is that they seem wholly unable to dress like normal people. In Britain, old men wear clothes which are full, cream, grey or white. The women tend to limit themselves to these colours combined with washed-out pastel shades. This habit has the disconcerting effect of making old people look faded and ethereal, as though they had just stepped out of a sepia-tinted photograph or were practising for the time when they become ghosts. This wasn't so bad in the days when life expectancy was low enough that encountering an old person was something of a rarity. In those days, the sight of one of these strangely dressed apparitions was no more than an occasional annoyance, like treading in something nasty on the pavement. Now, though, they appear everywhere, and it's impossible to walk down the street or go to the supermarket without coming across them. When visiting my local library last year, for instance, I was astounded to find that many of the bookshelves had been removed and replaced with old people. Where once there had been hundreds of books covering science, geography, travel, and the history of various nations, there were now tables covered with jigsaws and games of Scrabble. Instead of being able to browse in peace, one is now compelled to thread a path through old folk who had apparently nothing better to do with their lives than solve jigsaw puzzles. This brings us neatly to the other chief problem with the elderly, which is that they constantly block our way, both literally and metaphorically. The physical blocking is now a regular feature of urban life. In shops, on the street, and when using public transport, there seems invariably to be an old and often incapable person ahead of us. These people are in no hurry. Why should they be? After all, they don't have jobs to go to or children to look after or important things to do like normal people. They have all the time in the world to fumble with their purses when we are in a hurry at the queue for the checkout in the supermarket. Mention of supermarkets brings us neatly to another of the minor objections to the presence of old people in public, which is their exceedingly limited and frequently bizarre conversational powers. There is an unaccountable and inexplicable delusion shared by even the most rational of old people that the minutiae of their day-to-day life, whether relating to what happened this morning or many decades ago, is of interest to complete strangers encountered by chance in a public place. Just why the elderly should imagine for a moment that what they will be eating for lunch today, or where they worked in 1959, would be of any conceivable interest to anybody other than themselves is a complete mystery. It is, however, the fact that even making fleeting eye contact with an 80-year-old will usually be quite sufficient to open the floodgates of reminiscence and unleash a stream of consciousness-style monologue about the joys and tribulations of their lives from the end of the Second World War up to the present moment. Part of this is, of course, pure exhibitionism, which seems to grow exponentially past the age of 70. Talking of age brings us to one of the chief preoccupations of these people. I have never yet heard any ordinary or sane person waiting in line at the post office or bank turn to the people behind her and tell them how old she is. It sounds absurd to imagine a stranger suddenly announcing, apropos of nothing in particular, "I'm 24, you know." For those over the age of 70, this seems to be a second nature, a standard gambit when lost through a proper topic of conversation. They accost us, fix us with a glittering eye like the ancient mariner in Coleridge's famous poem, and announce proudly, "I'm 86, you know." The pride with which they declare their age is puzzling, unless you believe that simply dodging cars while crossing the road or failing to develop cancer or fall victim to a terrorist bomb is something praiseworthy and admirable in itself. It is not. Longevity is by itself no virtue. Of course, the outward physical appearance, along with the limited and restricted conversational powers of old people, are trivial matters indeed compared with the major problem which they represent to the rest of us. In recent years, they have begun to pose a far more serious difficulty for right-thinking individuals, which goes beyond merely getting on our nerves when we have the misfortune to come across them in the course of our day-to-day life. This is a subject which, although of enormous significance to an increasing number of people, is scarcely ever raised in public. Not only does it not appear in newspapers or on television reports, people hardly ever discuss it, even in the privacy of their own homes. This is a peculiar state of affairs, complete silence about something so important to so many people. The reason is simple. It entails longing wistfully for the death of other people, and is therefore seen to be reprehensible. As we remarked in the introduction, there was a time when parents and other relatives, childless uncles and aunts for example, would slip quietly away at the age of 65 or 70, leaving all their property and wealth to the generation below them. This was an excellent arrangement, for it meant that people in their 30s and 40s stood to inherit houses, land and cash at the very time they could make best use of it, which is to say when they were young enough to need more money for their families. Over the last few decades, this useful state of affairs has slowed down, halted, and then gone into reverse. Far from playing the part of fairy godmother and bestowing undeserved riches upon us and our children, the elderly relative has been imperceptibly transformed from a useful and profitable source of extra income into a surrogate and frequently demanding an unlikable child. We might profitably pause at this point and consider the truth of the assertion made at the beginning of this chapter that nobody likes old people. That the dislike of old people is a pretty general phenomenon and not one limited to a handful of miserable devils is easy to demonstrate. One or two examples should serve to illustrate this. British citizens give regularly and liberally to charities, donating many millions of pounds each year to worthy causes. Foreign donkeys, starving children in sub-Saharan Africa, cancer patients, castles owned by the National Trust, people who are blind or deaf, those who are unable to walk, whales, the list is endless. One need only consider for a moment the annual Children in Need appeal in Britain and the vast sums raised in the course of this evening of television fundraising to see just how generous we can be with our money. In a single evening, something in the region of £60 million is donated by the public for disabled, poor or ill children. Why do people give such a vast sum of money each year? The answer is simple. We like children. Try now to imagine a similar evening of television, which instead of being devoted to children, focused on old people who were poor or ill. Celebrities might visit a continence unit and see the trials and tribulations faced by old people who are incontinent of urine or faeces. Then it would be time to look around a hospice where those dying of cancer waited out their final days. Next would be a psychogeriatric ward full of demented old people who had forgotten their own names and spent the day gibbering and howling in between spells of heavy sedation. If all this sounds utterly grotesque, we need to ask ourselves why this should be. Why are television viewers happy to watch a programme concerned with children in wheelchairs or confined to cancer wards, but would immediately switch over if it featured the old and incapable? The answer is simple, of course. It is because we like children but dislike the elderly. Still on the subject of fundraising and charity donations, how many British readers have heard of Childline? It is to be doubted that there will be anybody in the United Kingdom who is not familiar with the name of Childline and can also give some account of the operation and purpose of this charitable endeavour. Childline was of course started by the television personality Esther Ranson. It has, since being founded over 30 years ago, become a national institution. Ranson started a similar project in 2013, aimed not at children but at old people. Who can name this service? Even when the name is given, the Silver Line, hardly anybody reading this book will have any interest in it, or having heard of it will wish to find out more or contribute money to the thing. It relies for funding not upon donations from the public, but by getting money from the National Lottery as a worthy cause. Pause for a moment and ask yourself why this might be and what it says about real attitudes to old people as opposed to those which we routinely claim. Incidentally, the name of the charity was artfully chosen. Rather than calling it Grey Line or Old Line, they chose Silver Line. Naming the enterprise after a precious metal was a smart move, avoiding as it does a negative connotation of being connected with old people. The British charity Help the Aged took a leaf out of Esther Ranson's books a few years after the founding of Silver Line. They had come to realise that the very name of their own charity, including as it did the word aged, was putting people off. The new name, Age UK, is more neutral, and the word age could refer to people of any age at all. Far more possible than aged, and without that alarming suggestion that we might be asked to help them. Here is another point which sheds light upon how we really feel about the elderly, as opposed to how we claim to feel. Ask people to name the very worst serial killers in British history, and you will find that names such as Mara Hindley crop up, along with Jack the Ripper or Fred and Rosemary West. There is a British serial killer who single-handedly killed 20 times as many people as those other 4 murderers put together. Harold Shipman, the rogue doctor who took the lives of over 400 people, never seems to be mentioned in anybody's list of wicked and ruthless killers. This is, at least on the face of it, more than a little odd. After all, he's not just the worst murderer in British history, but killed far more victims than even anybody in America, the home of serial killing. The reason for this neglect is simple and revealing. Harold Shipman, a much-loved GP, killed only old people. Dr. Shipman has not attracted the opprobrium of people like Myra Hindley, who's convicted of just a measly 2 murders. Her victims, though, were children, and as mentioned above, by and large, we are fond of children. This is a devastatingly simple, if unpalatable, truth. We don't rate Harold Shipman high in the annals of evil because he only killed the elderly. Many of us have a sneaking sympathy for the good doctor, if not outright admiration. Here is a man who could not abide at any cost whiny old folk, and his job brought him regularly into contact with all too many of them. Little wonder that he began disposing of the aged and decrepit nuisances painlessly and humanely through overdoses of morphine. Most of us would be tempted to pursue a similar course of action if our jobs entailed meeting old people so often, always assuming that we had the opportunity and means to do so. There can be few people stuck with cantankerous old relations who would not secretly be pleased if some public-spirited person like Dr. Shipman showed up at their parents' or grandparents' house one day, offering to give them one of his special injections. We would probably lend a hand, saying, "Come on, Mum, Dr. Shipman has come all this way just to see you. Roll up your sleeve, let him give you one of his strengthening injections." We return to the chief problem associated with old people, and, just as with obnoxious stepchildren, it is one which may never be voiced aloud and seldom acknowledged even to ourselves. Discoveries in medicine which have greatly increased the longevity of the population as a whole have simultaneously struck those raising young families with a sickening double whammy. Not only may they no longer look forward to the welcome injection of capital, which often happens when parents die, they are also faced with the burden of caring for these elderly encumbrances. At the same time, they are trying to earn a living and find time to spend with their children. Instead of taking the kids to the zoo, they have to go over to Granny's house to mow the lawn and fix that creaking door. Just when a parent thinks he or she can attend their daughter's school sports day, the realisation dawns that their 82-year-old father needs a lift to a hospital appointment that afternoon. The only open reference to the bind in which so many middle-aged adults are now called are light-hearted newspaper articles about the sandwich generation, which has been defined as adults aged between 40 and 70 who are taking care of ageing parents as well as their own children. Nobody wishes to admit that the majority of the people in this situation pray daily for the death of their parents, which would free everybody from the task of dancing attendance on inconvenient and all too frequently ungrateful old people, and also provide a much-needed boost for the finances. Of course, since most people, other than psychopaths, are such frightful hypocrites, these prayers for deliverance are framed in such a way as to suggest that they are being made for the benefit of the old person concerned, and not actuated by mercenary considerations. We hear things such as, "Her life is pretty wretched these days, she has nothing to look forward to," or "I can't help thinking that it'll be a mercy, really, when he goes. He's been ill for so long." In such ways does a decent person wish death upon relatives who are becoming a nuisance. Mention of death brings us naturally to a subject from which most people recoil in horror, but the psychopath contemplates with equanimity. This is death, something which polite society tries to hide from view, with as much assiduity as the Victorians concealed the genitals on classical statues by the addition of fig leaves.